Any health-related information on the following show provides general information only. Content presented on any show by any host or guest should not be substituted for a doctor's advice. Always consult your physician before beginning any new diet, exercise, or treatment program.
Welcome to the Accelerated Health TV and Radio Show. I'm your host, Sara Banta. I'm a wife, a busy mom of three, and the founder of the cutting edge and award-winning supplement brand Accelerated Health Products. This podcast is more than just a source of information. It's a community for you and those looking to optimize their health. I release new episodes every Monday and Tuesday live and a bonus one on Thursdays. So remember to subscribe and add to your playlist so you never miss a show. And join my free health group coaching on Telegram. There is no downside. I answer your questions. I post daily, and the details can be found on my website, sarabanthealth.com. My goal, and I need your help, is to reach everyone who needs me with my message of healing, so you can share this podcast with friends and loved ones, and together we can empower each other on our journey to optimal health. Today, I am super excited. We have a celebrity in my life. Maybe not yours, but he's in mine. And I'll tell you why in a minute. Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, with a wide range of research interests. He holds membership in the Undersea and Hyperbaric Medicine Society, Aerospace Medical Association, Society of Neuroscience, American Physiological Society, and the American Association of Cancer Research. Additionally, serving on numerous editorial boards and as a reviewer of dozens scholarship or scholarly publications and more. So Dr. Dom D'Agostino, please welcome him to our show. How are you today?
Thank you, Sarah. I'm doing well. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
So I teased you a little bit before we came on, and I told you that you changed my life. So 2015, I was in a gnarly car accident. I was rear-ended at the speed of 50 miles an hour. I was with my daughter, and my head hit the steering wheel, and I had stitches down to the bone over my eye. Of course, as a superhuman hero, I thought, oh, well, I'm going to be fine. Just a little blood, and I'll be off to my normal routine tomorrow morning. And then I get to the hospital, stitches, all of that fun stuff. And at 2 a.m., pounding headache, realized the damage that I really had done. So that was just the beginning. And I had just been introduced to exogenous ketones, really didn't understand them. I had always been on a high protein, low carb diet. That's what always worked for me. But then I listened to you on a podcast for 2 hours. And I think I listened to that podcast at least 4 times, over and over and over again, because it connected the dots for those exogenous ketones, not for me for weight loss, but for the brain. Because after that car accident, I suffered from memory loss, anxiety. I couldn't write a market list. I would start crying. I got overwhelmed. I remember being in the shower and forgetting to rinse my shampoo out of my hair. I mean, here I am, a straight A Stanford student who now can't write a market list. And I thought, oh my gosh, I've got 3 young kids. What am I going to do? I have to pull myself together. And you gave me the confidence and reassured me that these exogenous ketones was going to give me some brain power that I never experienced before. And I wish I had those during my years at Stanford, because the mental clarity that I have today at the age of 48 is far superior than during my college years. So that's where I want to start. And I also have, it reminds me of just last week, my 21-year-old son, who sometimes we all say in our family, he's got rocks in his heads. He decided to do a 3-day fast, and he did it. And yes, he got through it fine. He's all into his health. He had leukemia at the age of 9. And so he really takes his health seriously. But after the fast, he comes home and I find him in my kitchen cleaning out all the drawers. And I'm like, what are you doing? And he goes, Mom, I feel like the ketones are still in my brain from the fast, and I just needed to do something productive. And I was laughing because that is the response that most people get when they switch to feeling those ketones in their brain and their body. So there's so many benefits to it, and we'll get into the cons as well. But I just wanted to
Mhm.
share that little bit. And I know that was a long time ago, and your research has progressed significantly in what you're doing. So, but why don't we start with just the basics of the ketogenic diet? What is ketosis? And why has it become so trendy and popular?
Yeah. Well, before I begin, thank you for sharing that. That was interesting. And I have gotten many similar emails. I get a lot of emails with people who have had like brain injuries or concussions that responded similar to you.
Yes.
So to answer your question, well, it's important that like, as I talk, we study ketogenic diet and exogenous ketones. We put it under the umbrella of therapeutic ketosis for specific neurological disorders and also cancer and those things. So keep that in mind, like as I talk about, pros and the cons eventually, and what ketosis is as a medical therapy. So I think of the ketogenic diet as a prescription strength low carb diet. So it is technically a medical prescription. So there's a 4-to-1 ketogenic diet, the classical ketogenic diet developed at Mayo Clinic, 4 parts fat to 1 part protein. And it's very high in fat and moderate to actually low in protein, the pediatric version of it for epilepsy. So this diet, therapeutic ketosis and the ketogenic diet, is defined specifically by a macronutrient ratio of fats to proteins to little or no carbs that produces a physiological state, which is ketosis, that can be measured with objective biomarkers. And that's beta hydroxybutyrate, which is the most abundant form of ketones in the blood. And then we have acetoacetate, which is typically measured in the urine. And then there's breath. Breath acetone is also measured. And breath acetone correlates with seizure control. So that's like, it is a valid biomarker. And the acetone that we're blowing off in our breath when on a ketogenic diet or fasting, like those carbons all come from body fat or dietary fat. so ketones are really directly correlated with fat oxidation. So, and a lot of people sort of like overinterpret that and just say it's the best fat, weight loss diet, and that's the best diet for insulin resistance and other things. And there's some truth to that. It's, it's one solution, but most importantly, the metabolic state of ketosis changes the neuropharmacology of your brain in a way that prevents seizures, but it also impacts brain energy metabolism, neurotransmitter levels, and things that can be therapeutic. And that's kind of how we study it. But it's the only diet that you can like legitimately measure with an objective biomarker, which makes it very interesting to us because there are different degrees of ketosis that can be used and it can be personalized. And there's different ways to achieve that through, as you mentioned, fasting, ketogenic diet, or ketone supplementation.
Right. And I'm glad you brought up the measurements because when I first learned about ketosis, blood, I was told and understood that the blood test didn't necessarily give you feedback as to how you were utilizing ketones if you were taking exogenous ketones, because you just drink a whole bunch of exogenous ketones, the blood will increase, but that's not necessarily indicating that you're actually creating ketones in your own body from dietary fat or from burning your own body fat, whereas the breath test was more accurate. Would that be correct?
Yeah, you bring up a good point that a lot of people actually don't realize or recognize is that when our body is producing ketones, or if you drink exogenous ketones in the form of esters or ketone salts, the level of ketosis is not indicative of your body using those ketones. It's almost like I had a person the other day that's eating 400 grams of carbs a day, and then they sent me like his glucose levels and his CGM, which was pretty flat because he's kind of an athlete. So his consumption of carbohydrates and glucose, which was part of what he was feeding himself, did not show up in his blood because his actually his CGM was like completely flat. So, and I see that in people that are metabolically healthy, especially athletes, that they can consume ketones, and because there's rapid ketone utilization in the tissue, there's rapid ketone disposal. So like you could do I coined the term ketone tolerance test. Like if you take a sedentary person that's not very metabolically healthy and you give them a dose of ketones, you could see a very large rise and it comes down kind of slow. Whereas someone who's like lean and metabolically fit, if they consume ketones, they clear it really quick. And that's their body, their brain, their heart, and peripheral tissues using the ketones as an energy source. So this needs to be appreciated. With the ketone salts, they get absorbed slower. The ketone esters and like 1,3-butadiene need to be metabolized by the liver, which is actually not. Although we've published, a lot of what we've published is with the ketone esters. The issue I have with the esters is that they're typically 1,3-butadiene based, and to convert them to ketones, it goes through the alcohol dehydrogenase pathway, and you create like a beta hydroxybutyrate aldehyde. And it's putting stress on your liver. It's not doing your liver any favors. I'll just put it that way. Whereas the salts, it's bound to a monovalent or divalent cation. That was actually the original idea that I had that, became like patents later, that you can take sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, and bind it to beta hydroxybutyrate. And that's what I typically recommend to people. We do research on the esters and they have their place, but for everyday sort of applications, the beta hydroxybutyrate with sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium is kind of like, and different ratios of that is probably kind of ideal. And when people consume them, they'll get different levels depending upon how quick their body's using ketones.
Right. We've created at Accelerated Health Products a product called Accelerated Fast, and it uses the BHBs in there and then has other ingredients to help cleanse the liver, help suppress appetite, and increase ATP all in one. So it's giving you that boost so you can fast, but then you can you don't necessarily have to be on a high fat ketogenic diet to get the benefits from being in ketosis part of the day. And that's where I have kind of come to, and we can get into more of that in a little bit, but back to the therapeutic uses for ketosis, you do a lot of research in cancer. Can you explain why the ketogenic diet might be helpful for someone with cancer?
Sure. The ketogenic diet, by virtue of carbohydrate will limit glucose availability to the tumor. So that's one thing, because there'll be less sort of carbohydrates, less glucose in circulation. And it'll also decrease the glucose spikes, and it also suppresses the hormone insulin. And that's actually how we make ketones in the body, is that once you suppress the hormone insulin, that ramps up fat oxidation in the liver. And then the liver produces ketones. And the liver actually, interestingly, does not use ketones as an energy source. The liver lacks an enzyme called succinyl-CoA transferase. And that particular enzyme is also deficient in cancer cells. So so the liver produces ketones and it gets into peripheral circulation. So your brain can use them in your heart and your, skeletal muscle. So in regards to cancer, there's a lot of things going on. It's restricting the primary source of energy for cancer. That's one thing. It's reducing insulin, which is decreasing glycolysis globally, but also in the cancer. And it's elevating ketones, which have kind of a favorable effect on your healthy cells, but your cancer cells have a limited ability to use ketones as an energy source, just because they have metabolic alterations and mitochondrial changes in mitochondrial function that prevent them from using ketones as an energy source. There is data to suggest that some more indolent cancers can, And then also some cancers can use ketones as for biosynthesis, but not as much as, for example, glucose. And then therapeutic ketosis also reduces inflammation, and inflammation is a driver for cancer. And so in our lab right now, my student Sara, spelled the same way your name is her, she's looking at beta hydroxybutyrate as an epigenetic regulator. So turning on gene expression that's favorable for neurological diseases, but also activating gene pathways that can suppress cancer growth too is one of the things that we're looking at. So it's really multifactorial, and we never study therapeutic ketosis in the context of like a standalone approach. We always study therapeutic ketosis from the perspective as an adjuvant to further augment the therapeutic efficacy of other forms of cancer therapy. That could be chemo or radiation, but we really focus on non-toxic therapy. So we're looking at different metabolic drugs. But another category is immune therapies, like the checkpoint inhibitors, specifically the PD-1 inhibitors. So there was a Nature paper that came out that showed a vegan diet can enhance innate immunity, whereas a ketogenic diet, just 2 weeks, can enhance adaptive immunity. And the ability of a short-term ketogenic diet to augment adaptive immunity would mean that it could enhance checkpoint inhibitors like Keytruda or like the PD-1 inhibitor. So there has been an interest in mainstream academia for using ketogenic diets for a wide variety of applications, but to enhance certain cancer therapies.
Interesting. Well, nowadays, 2024, we are in a new world. We've got 1,000 different chemicals coming at us: GMOs, glyphosate, air toxicity, fluoride in the water, the spike protein. Everything has changed, and our livers are being bombarded with all of this. And even people that aren't eating sugar necessarily are getting insulin resistance. And we don't necessarily need to get into all of that, but that insulin resistance is presenting itself as increased Alzheimer's and dementia, fatty liver disease, PCOS, and hormonal imbalances. So can you explain how the ketogenic diet is helpful in combating this insulin resistance and then the cascade of these diseases that follow?
Yeah, you bring up the liver, and I do think we've always thought the liver is really the master regulator of metabolism, right? And I'm a little bit biased because it's like, the site of ketogenesis, but it is, it does everything. Like when the glucose in your blood comes from the liver, so the liver regulates gluconeogenesis, of course, but also glycogenolysis, and the level of glucose or glycogen in your liver will dictate like your metabolism and all the signaling associated with it. So gut hormones, so many different things. In regards to insulin resistance, so ketogenic diets can help with that for sure. It's just one solution. Of course, exercise, any form of caloric restriction, as long as it's not like overly abundant in like fructose, like typically as like sugar sweetened beverages, things like that, can contribute to non-alcoholic fatty liver. What was really surprising to us in data that we've presented at conferences and we're preparing for peer-reviewed publication is that we studied people that were non-diabetic, generally healthy people. And when we did a high resolution ultrasound of them, in addition to a low carb diet as an intervention to look at metabolic optimization, we did not expect it, but we found that the large majority of them had the precursor to non-alcoholic fatty liver, hepatic steatosis. So we saw this, and that was kind of a shock to me, which made me think that, more people need to be looking at it. And it didn't necessarily show up on their blood work. Some of them had high ALT levels, but not within the range of, some people had high liver enzymes here or there for different reasons. Maybe they had an infection or something like that. But generally speaking, you couldn't really predict it from the blood work. But the liver scans, CT is the gold standard, but you don't necessarily want to expose yourself to the radiation. But there are some pretty good high resolution ways to look at that with an ultrasound. So new technologies that that can allow for that. So, and so the liver is really the master regulator of insulin resistance, and keeping the liver healthy, I think, is probably the most important thing to do. And that's essentially just like, reducing sugar, making sure you don't have surplus amount of calories, diet, exercise, keeping your metabolic machinery, especially your skeletal muscle, active, and just being active in general. But titrating the amount of carbohydrates for you personally. And that's something it's very individualistic. Some athletes can tolerate 500 grams of carbs a day, and some people get signs of insulin resistance or carbohydrate intolerance at just 80 to 100 grams a day, especially if they're like sedentary. So I think the only way to like unambiguously know this is to get blood work, and actually wear a continuous glucose monitor to look at postprandial glucose elevations and it coming down. That's really the only way to do it. And I think it's more important, actually, maybe more important for people who do follow a high carb diet, because I wear a CGM and I do a low carb keto diet and it's perfectly flat. It's very boring. But if you are an athlete and you're trying to optimize your carbohydrate to your activity levels and things like that, you want to use a CGM as a tool to titrate the amount of carbohydrates per meal, and then actually titrate it in during exercise too. A lot of what we do is low carb and ketogenic stuff, but I think, and we use CGMs, and it shows a remarkable decrease in just circadian glucose. We published a paper with Dr. Jeff Volek and Dr. Noakes and Dr. Philip Prinz and Dr. Andrew Kutnick with essentially elite level athletes on a high carb diet versus low carb diet. And the high carb diet, they both perform the same, but the high carb diet showed unambiguously an elevation of glucose throughout the day. And at 3 of the subjects, it was only 10 subjects in a crossover design study. 3 of the subjects were essentially pre-diabetic, with standard carbohydrate-based diet used. And that was important, because if those numbers were to be maintained for like a decade, that would have pretty significant metabolic consequences for those individuals. So even people who are metabolically fit and athletic run the risk of, insulin resistance and carbohydrate intolerance. So that's why it's important to measure.
Yeah, I wore a CGM for a couple months and it was very telling. My spikes were high, but they came down very healthily and very quickly. I actually had my daughter ask me this morning, Mom, does working out raise your blood sugar? Yes, it does, because your body's, your liver's letting go of the glucose and burning that for fuel. But so they're becoming aware of their blood sugar and the importance of it. And I believe that if you were to compare someone on a high carb diet today versus someone 30 years ago, same amount of carbs, same macronutrient profile, the person today would have a higher risk of insulin resistance because of where are they getting their carbs from? Processed foods, GMOs, all of these other factors that weren't necessarily around as much 30 years ago. Eating a whole potato or rice is different than eating Rice Krispie treats and Doritos and Gatorade. And, even if you're an athlete, I've got a daughter that's at USC rowing for the team. You go into their amazing athletic facility and the free snacks and the protein snacks are the little peanut butter and cracker things. And then you've got the Gatorade. The stuff is there's no awareness, even at the highest level of nutrition, of what is real food. And we've gotten away from real food, which has compounded the issue. And that's why I think the ketogenic diet became so popular, was people were searching for answers. And there's all of this unexplained weight gain, which brings me to the topic of weight loss and the ketogenic diet as a possibility for a therapeutic use. But do you want to be doing it long term? So if you could talk about how that can help with weight loss, it's obviously tied to, calories are calories. So caloric restriction's part of it, but possibly this appetite suppressant effect, the insulin sensitivity effect. but I want to get into, is it, long-term, is that good? Or is there a balance there?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good question. If we look at validated applications of the ketogenic diet, weight loss would be one of them. Evidence-based applications based upon the literature. A ketogenic diet, I'm not like, a randomized control trial fundamentalist, an RCT fundamentalist, if you want to use it. I heard someone use that term recently because you have to realize that most RCTs are funded by an entity, could be mostly pharma, that want to kind of prove a point. But a ketogenic diet does have about 6 RCTs behind it for different applications. Of course, epilepsy and the things that kind of we study. But in regards to weight loss, yeah, there's good evidence. I'm looking at, I have PubMed open right now. I think there's about 25 clinical trials that would support. I know one of them's 52 weeks, another's 2 years, because you asked about sustainability. I think in the right environment and you screen out and get the right people. What we've learned is that, when you do a clinical trial up front, you really have to, even with the best screening, and you have people that are super enthusiastic and they're like, okay, I'm on this diet, but I'm fully enthusiastic to follow this and committed. You'll get about 20% dropout rate, even when you do everything, even when you have them almost meeting daily with like a registered dietitian, and you have like Facebook groups for social groups to help them and everything. So and if we didn't screen them, I think it'd probably be like 40 or 50%. So realistically, a lot of people, I kind of live in an echo chamber that says everybody who follows keto says it's so easy, it's indulging, it's, why can't people follow it? But I think about my family and just growing up Italian with pasta and pizza, and just, it is a restrictive diet. People feel restrictive. I mean, simple pleasures like summer fruit and, and just vegetables and just other things that could be part of a healthy, normal diet. These are typically restricted to almost nothing on a legitimate therapeutic ketogenic diet. So that's why I kind of gravitate to just, unless it's a medical disorder, a low carb diet that regulates glucose and insulin. And you can get the benefits of ketones, as you mentioned, with exogenous ketones. Mm-hmm. So like a low carb Mediterranean diet with even MCT oil or exogenous ketones is kind of what I'm almost adopted in my life. And that's, unless you're really managing disorder, and that would be ideal, I think, for weight loss too. Unless you have someone who's very overweight and insulin resistant, a carbohydrate restriction to the point of ketogenic can be helpful once you get that person on track. And then you could start titrating the carbohydrates in, fibrous carbs in, ideally, to sort of optimize their hunger. But the appetite suppressing effect of a ketogenic diet is real, because not just the fat, but also the protein, like a higher protein ketogenic diet is real. And even things like MCT oil, most people don't know this, but it's a GLP-1 secretagogue. It also stimulates GIP. There's these drugs on the market. Everybody hears all about it. But protein and certain medium chain fatty acids can get your body to release those hunger hormones.
Right. And that is, well, first of all, as far as Ozempic and the other drugs like it, the amount of side effects that just keep on coming out. And I just did a podcast on the fact that it's increasing blindness in people. But what people don't understand is that's not changing your lifestyle habits. And what I'm seeing, and I could be wrong, and there's no data, but what I'm visually seeing, because I live in the town that has more women on Ozempic than even Beverly Hills, is that people are actually gaining the weight back. So after a certain amount of time, they're gaining the weight back, and they're gaining fat back, and they've lost muscle, lost fat together, but then they're gaining only fat back. So let's stay away from those. There are other options. With the exogenous ketones, like with the accelerated fast that I mentioned, I've had people come to me, Sarah, I don't know anything about this fasting thing. I wake up at 6 a.m. I've got to eat something right away. I go to bed and I have to have a snack. And then 2 weeks in, they're like, what did you just do to me? It's 3 p.m. and I'm still not hungry because it suppressed my appetite. And one of the negative side effects that people say with being on a ketogenic diet is that it's stressful, right? It's a hormetic stressor. And if you're already stressed, that's stressing your body too much. What I like about exogenous ketones is I believe it's taking that stress away because your body's not stressed. It has a different fuel system other than that glucose. So it's calmed down, but then you're still getting that benefit of maybe a little more intermittent fasting than you would normally do. And you can incorporate the whole food carbs to titrate according to your activity level, your age, your hormonal balance, and all of that. And when you get into female health, different times of your cycle, you need more carbs or you need less. And this is something that I'm teaching my daughters because they're athletes. There's different times of the month that they want to try to PR on their erg scores for rowing versus other times of the month. So with women, it's more of a roller coaster and it's a little more of a delicate dance. What I've seen, though, when keto really became popular a few years ago and then people were on it long term, what I was seeing was if they had just one morsel of carbohydrate, they'd blow up. And they felt like, I can't eat, my body doesn't even know what to do with carbs now because it's not flexible. So that was one thing. And then like the restriction. But this brings me to where I think you and I both have come to is more of a flexible dieting outlook. And so can you talk about what that means and how you've changed maybe your outlook on keto versus a more flexible dieting approach?
Yeah. And I want to kind of reinforce that. I guess what I'm going to describe or talk about is for like the average person out there who's not necessarily using a ketogenic diet for the metabolic management of a neurological disorder, cancer, maybe even things like type 2 diabetes. We study inborn errors of metabolism, where the ketogenic diet is actually the standard of care. So this is not that. I think for the average person, everyday person could get 90% of the benefits without the side effects. And we could talk about the pros and the cons with following just a low carb diet and then titrating the carbohydrates in a way for the activity levels we're very much about like biomarker monitoring. So I was a little bit skeptical about, the females having a reactive response to ketogenic diet in regards to elevated cortisol. That kept coming out. And I started people were reaching out to me and I requesting blood work to see the elevated or salivary cortisol levels. And some people do have that. So the only way to determine that is to measure, right? You want to do comprehensive blood work, also hormones. And with cortisol, probably to get to diurnal, to get multiple saliva cortisol levels throughout the day. We use that in our research for different projects that we do. So like ZRT Labs, and there's a number of companies out there where you can get it, fairly cheap. So, so ketogenic diets some people respond remarkably well, and they actually have no overt signs of like hormonal dysregulation. But what I have observed on online forums and also in emails that people send me their blood work and actually what they're eating and what they're doing. When a lot of people start a ketogenic diet, it's calorie restricted. They're over exercising on top of that. So they're producing a calorie deficit that results in metabolic adaptation, which is, from a health point of view could be seen as advantageous, but it's a slowing of your metabolic rate in a way. So it's like the mitochondria are actually becoming more efficient at using the food energy that you're giving it. So you could, basically maintain your body weight on less calories. And that could be if you're on a calorie restricted diet for 6 months, it can take like 3 to 6 months to come back to that. A lot of people don't realize that a lot of people think you could just jump right back into your own. So there's like, people have coined the term reverse dieting to titrate your calories back up again. And I think that's, a valid approach to do that. You just can't go back to eating the rate. And I think when you talk about people blowing up, I think that's the case too, because your body is very sensitive to the hormone insulin. And if you go out and eat pizza, not only, you're spiking your insulin, what that does is it enhances sodium reabsorption at the level of the kidneys. So, and that actually expands, your plasma volume. So your blood pressure goes up, you feel puffy. That plasma volume, it spills over into your peripheral tissue. So it looks like you're holding water, your face gets puffy, your hands get puffy. So physiologically, I can picture all these things that's happening, but to the general population, they just say they blow up. So there's a way to reintroduce carbs in a more sane way to get your body back to using it again. It's not like you can't do one or the other, but a lot of people just kind of go off the wagon and overindulge. And that's a big problem, because when you're on a restrictive diet and then you go off and you have like a slice of pizza, it's like, okay, well, I went off my diet, I might as well eat the whole pizza. Right. So this is sort of the general mentality. And I can relate because I used to be like that, years ago. So
yeah, I heard you mention that your wife is able to have like a bite of Ben and Jerry's and you'd eat the whole pint. And, when I first met my husband, we would have the huge tub of Pillsbury cookie dough in the freezer. And he literally would take one scoop, cook one cookie. And I'm like, what are you doing? I want to eat the whole thing. So it was either none or all of it. And that is true. And a lot of people with the ketogenic diet say, oh, well, calories don't matter because I'm not raising my insulin. I can eat all I want. I can eat a ton of nuts. I can eat a ton of dairy. No. And what they don't realize is those two foods specifically are meant to fatten up the animals during, milk is supposed to fatten up the baby cows, and nuts are meant to fatten up the animals for winter. So calories do matter. I want to get into the goal is, and I just did a podcast on this yesterday, the goal is to increase ATP, increase mitochondrial health, because with increased ATP and mitochondrial health, longevity occurs. And that is the goal. I mean, whatever diet someone is trying, whether it's vegan, carnivore, paleo, keto, the goal is to increase energy so they feel better in their brain and their body. And with more energy, weight loss occurs, immune system thrives, cancers die, all of that stuff. So can you explain the mechanism of how a ketogenic diet can improve ATP or mitochondrial health?
Okay. Yeah. There are different ways that it does this. One way is, the standard American diet really never produces ketosis and never even lowers your blood glucose to really tap into your fat reserves, right? So to any appreciable level, when we do things like intermittent fasting or even just restrict carbohydrates, that allows greater metabolic flexibility. So we start using fat more as a fuel source over glucose. Glucose is oxidized by the mitochondria. There's glucose oxidation in mitochondria, but fats and ketones are metabolized exclusively in the mitochondria. And actually, when we rapidly, and we see this in animal models and we see it in humans too, when we rapidly transition to a ketogenic diet, there's actually an increase in oxidative stress and mitochondrial stress because globally speaking, it puts such high demands on the mitochondria that it actually results in like a transient mitochondrial dysfunction, but a compensatory activation of gene pathways that stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis and increase mitochondrial function. So what we see over time with a ketogenic diet is that the tissues, the muscle tissues, for example, if you do a biopsy in a low carb athlete that's, transitioned to a ketogenic diet, is that the mitochondrial density would be higher than the athlete that's a high carb athlete. So this is the higher mitochondrial content number, structure, and function is enhanced because we're transitioning away from glucose and carbohydrates as a fuel source, which is glycolysis, and a reliance almost exclusively in the context of endurance events or even resting metabolism, really, just a much higher percentage of fatty acid and ketone metabolism, which is exclusively through the mitochondria. So we see some favorable changes in mitochondrial structure, and mitochondrial function, mitochondrial number. So all these things, what I just mentioned, result in a greater ability for that tissue to produce ATP. So you actually have you have a greater ATP reserve when you have greater metabolic flexibility. So that becomes beneficial. And these changes in animal models can happen in like 2 weeks. And I think in humans, probably like 6 weeks. We talk about this a lot, like, as a research group, but probably 6 to 8 weeks. And probably you see like really robust, statistically significant effects at 12 weeks when you transition someone to, especially athletes, because adaptations happen faster. So yeah, generally speaking, mitochondrial number, structure, and function all improve if we transition away from glucose metabolism to ketone and fatty acid metabolism.
I love the feeling of being in ketosis. And that's why, I still take the exogenous ketones every day. I have no weight to lose. I'm actually trying to build muscle and go in the opposite direction. But the brain power, the physical energy, my workouts are better. There's just, and that's why I love the combination of the exogenous ketones, but then a high protein diet, low carb. Adding in the carbs strategically, I use a lot of fruits and whole foods. I don't do the processed foods, and that's a big deal. Okay, so we have like 8 minutes left. Dom, I knew this was going to happen. The biggest downfalls or pitfalls of the ketogenic diet.
Yeah, there's cons. There's a lot of cons, and that's why I gravitate towards my recommendation is like a low carb Mediterranean diet for the average. But with the cons of the ketogenic diet, we talked about like it's restrictive. There's potential nutrient deficiencies. So supplementation of things like potassium, calcium, magnesium, which it sounds like your ketone supplement has that in it. And I am a fan again of exogenous ketones in the form of ketone salts over the ketone esters, although a lot of research I do is with the ketone esters. They have their applications. There's potential for kidney stones a little bit higher, at least in the literature, with a clinical keto, but that can be mitigated with electrolytes. So potassium, calcium, magnesium. If you have gallbladder issues, a high-fat diet's kind of hard to do. Pancreatitis, liver disease, fatty acid oxidation disorders, sort of the things that are standard. What I talk about are carnitine, primary and secondary carnitine deficiency. What shows up quite often in blood work that I see in, like, for example, kids on a ketogenic diet is carnitine deficiency, because your body's oxidizing so much fat that it's almost, and carnitine is required for that fat oxidation. It carries the fatty acids to the mitochondria. It can deplete the body of carnitine, especially if you're not on a high, especially if you're not eating a lot of meat. So for people that are like carnivore, they don't have to worry about that, because even the word carnitine comes from carn, the word that means meat. So carnivore. So you get an abundant amount of carnitine if you're eating a lot of animal and meat products. So that's something to consider. And then, we talked about it a little bit, but with females, there's potential for amenorrhea. So especially if there's a female athlete, like a runner who tends to, the whole like female triad happens with female athletes. If they're on low carb or ketogenic diets, that tends to be more robust, that female triad. And so amenorrhea is a real thing, but that typically can be averted in females if the protein level is sufficient and high enough. So for an athlete, a female athlete, 1 gram per pound sounds like a lot, but is what I would recommend. Then a potential for reduced thyroid, which is lower T3 to T4. We've seen that, and actually there's a publication on that, but there's no other overt side effects of like low T3, even though it shows up on blood work. the women that were in that study are all like fantastic athletes with great body compositions. So, so even though low T3 could show up, that could just be indicative of greater thyroid sensitivity, receptor sensitivity. So it's something to consider, but I think that's an area that needs further research.
Yeah,
I
that's
think I
really
covered most of
interesting.
it. Yeah.
Yeah, and I talked to, Dr. Amy Horniman is a thyroid expert, and she's been on my show quite a bit. And she always says, how do you feel? You're your best doctor. I mean, if your
Yep.
blood test is saying one thing, but you have great energy, let's go with how you feel. So that is a nuance with the thyroid hormones. I do believe if you are on a ketogenic diet with not enough protein long term, then yes, your body might be suffering and might lower its metabolic rate and lower its thyroid function for sure. And that is why I do promote 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight as far as protein goes, a higher protein diet, just like you do. And I am just super excited to have had you on, Dom. And what are you working on now, and where can people find you?
Great. Well, thank you for asking. Appreciate that. I'm working on teaching. I teach, from the undergrad level, the master's, PhD, and medical students. So with medical students right now, I mentioned that because that's part of a nutrition course that's like a requirement now at the USF, Morsani College of Medicine. So I mentored them on, we're looking at allulose and other sugar alternatives. And allulose is kind of interesting to me, and comparing them to other sugar alternatives because it's got some functional properties, GLP-1 releasing effects and things like that. So we're doing a systematic review on that, having the students do that, continuous glucose monitor research as a behavioral tool. So doing that, we're doing a lot of different research projects, allulose and cancer. So allulose uses the GLUT5 transporter, as does fructose, but it can't be metabolized, it seems, by cancer cells. So that's something that we're looking into. A lot of animal model work on different like rare diseases. We're doing that. Different stuff with the military, some projects with NASA, microbiome projects. Actually, today we're working on that. My website is ketonutrition.org, which covers a lot of the things that I'm talking about here. I also host the Metabolic Health Summit conference and co-host that, and co-host the Metabolic Link podcast, which we have many speakers who speak at our conference. We have basic science and clinicians and dietitians talk about a range of different topics, nutrition and metabolism related. So I think that's
Amazing.
everything. Yeah.
And when you do your research on allulose, put in there researching and whether it's high histamine, because that is something that I have experienced. And histamines tend to be a lot more prevalent now because of the spike protein infiltrating it into all of us. So I'd love your feedback if you ever come across that research with allulose and histamine. So
I'll do a dive into that. I don't know why it would. I know, the molecule itself doesn't have any histaminergic effects, but then again, we're talking about triggering histamine reactions, right? And I think you do bring up a very good point about the spike protein, whether from COVID or the vaccine, that people's histamine hyperreactivity, and we're not talking about it. I'm glad you mentioned it there, because that people are getting a lot of autoimmune hyperreactivity, and I think a lot of it's histamine related. I think even I had like a little bit of it. So I think that's definitely an area that researchers need to be exploring and doing research on. So glad you bring that up. But I think dietary interventions, like even restrictive diets, carnivore diets, ketogenic diets, can help with that, because people email me, they have these problems, and ketogenic diets help.
absolutely. Well, thank you so much. And thank you, everyone else, for tuning in today. If you need my help with your health concerns, you know where to find me, sarabantahealth.com. I'm happy to put together a protocol for you, and join my free group coaching on Telegram. There's no downside. I share daily tips and tools to improve your health, answer your questions. You'll be surrounded by an amazing community of people who are on the same path as you. Don't forget to follow me on social media at Accelerated Health Products, and you can catch this podcast on over 100 platforms, including Spotify, iTunes, and iHeartRadio. Just search for Accelerated Health TV and Radio Show. I'm on a mission to share my healing message with everyone who's ready to listen and not those who aren't. So help me with this goal. Share this podcast with a few of your friends who might benefit. And remember, I'm live every Monday and Tuesday, and you can use coupon WELCOME10 to get 10% off your first order if you want to try the accelerated fast to get that ketone bump and then follow it with a higher protein diet, incorporating the carbs where they fit into your diet. You can do that as well. Thanks again for joining us here, and have a great week.